Good morning. I will have a statement, and then I would be happy to take some questions. Okay. The American people are being misled about President Obama's plan to regulate the Internet. Last week's carefully managed rollout was designed to downplay the plan's massive intrusion into the Internet economy and to shield many critical details from the public. Indeed, Chairman Wheeler has made it clear that he will not release the document to the public, even though federal law authorizes him to do so. I believe the public has a right to know what its government is doing, particularly when it comes to something as important as Internet regulation. I have now read the 332-page plan, and it is worse than I had imagined. So today, I want to correct the record and explain key aspects of what President Obama's plan will actually do. First, the claim that President Obama's plan to regulate the Internet does not include rate regulation is flat out false. The plan clearly states that the FCC can regulate the rates that Internet service providers charge for broadband Internet access, for interconnection, for transit, in short, for the core aspects of Internet services. To be sure, the plan says that the FCC will not engage in what it calls ex-ante rate regulation. But this only means that the FCC won't set rates ahead of time. The plan repeatedly states that the FCC will apply Sections 201 and 202 of the Communications Act, including the rate regulation provisions, to determine whether the prices charged by broadband providers are unjust or unreasonable. The plan also repeatedly invites complaints about Sections 201 and 202 violations from end users and edge providers alike. Thus, for the first time, the FCC would claim the power to declare broadband Internet rates and charges unreasonable after the fact. Indeed, the only limit on the FCC's discretion to regulate rates is its own determination of whether rates are just and reasonable, which isn't much of a restriction at all. Now, lest anyone take comfort in the notion that the FCC will allow the market to set prices through competition, the plan goes out of its way to reiterate its view that competition is limited. And it uses the FCC's artificial new 25 megabit per second yardstick for broadband to claim that competition doesn't exist for a majority of Americans. Now, to think that rate regulation and other utility-style regulation will not happen in the face of such findings is naive. Second, President Obama's plan targets pro-competitive broadband service offerings, both actual and potential, that benefit consumers. The plan expressly states that usage-based pricing, data allowances, really any offers other than an unlimited, all-you-can-eat data plan are now subject to FCC regulation. Indeed, the plan finds that these practices will be subject to case-by-case review under the plan's new Internet Conduct Standards. That standard evaluates at least 7 vaguely defined factors in determining whether a practice is allowed. The plan makes clear that these practices are now on the chopping block, with those of mobile operators under special scrutiny. This means that consumers who use less data may end up subsidizing consumers who use more data. Moreover, the President's plan goes out of its way to say that sponsored data plans and zero rating programs, like T-Mobile's Music Freedom offering, may violate the new standard for Internet conduct. Preventing companies from differentiating themselves from the competition by giving consumers a wide variety of options will simply mean less choice and less free data for consumers. My bottom line, if you like your current service plan, you should be able to keep your current service plan. The FCC shouldn't take it away from you. Third, President Obama's plan gives the FCC broad and unprecedented discretion to micromanage the Internet. This plan gives a Washington bureaucracy a blank check to decide how internet service providers deploy and manage their networks, from the last mile all the way through to the internet backbone. Take interconnection as just one example. The plan states that the FCC can determine when a broadband provider must establish physical interconnection points, where they must locate those points, how much they can charge for the provision of that infrastructure, and how they will route traffic over those connections. That is anything but light touch regulation. And the plan extends the FCC's interventionist gaze well beyond this part of the network. Small wonder, then, that some pro-regulation activists are already deeming the FCC the Department of the Internet. Fourth, the President's plan is a gift to trial lawyers. The plan allows class action lawsuits with attorney's fees should any trial lawyer want to challenge an Internet service provider's network management practices or rates. Indeed, the plan expressly declines to forbear from Sections 206 and 207 of the Act, which authorize such private rights of action. And it adopts a theory of broadband subscriber access services, that is, services that broadband providers supply to edge providers, that would allow anyone online to file a complaint or to go to court. The end result will be more litigation, less innovation, and fewer benefits to the American broadband consumer. Fifth, the President's plan makes clear that more utility-style regulation is coming. In discussing additional rate regulation, tariffs, last-mile unbundling, burdensome administrative filing requirements, accounting standards, and entry and exit regulation, the plan repeatedly states that it is only forbearing at this time. The plan is quite clear about the limited duration of its forbearance determinations, stating that the FCC will revisit these determinations in the future and proceed in an incremental manner with respect to additional regulation. In other words, expect regulation to ratchet up and forbearance to fade. Sixth, President Obama's plan to regulate the Internet explicitly opens the door to billions of dollars in new taxes on broadband. The plan repeatedly states that it is only deferring a decision on new broadband taxes, such as Universal Service Fund fees and telecommunications relay service fees, among others, not prohibiting them. And it takes pains to make clear that nothing in the draft is intended to foreclose future state or federal tax increases. Indeed, the plan engages in the same two-step we saw last year with respect to the E-rate program. Lay the groundwork to increase taxes in the first order, and then raise them in the second. One independent estimate puts the price tag of these and other fees at $11 billion. In the end, when you compare what the American public is being told about President Obama's plan to regulate the Internet with the actual text of that plan, these and other discrepancies become apparent. And in my view, that makes it all the more important for the FCC to let the American public see this plan before the FCC makes it the law. We should be able to have an open, transparent debate about the President's plan. And with that, I would be happy to take your questions.
Okay, we'll start with this.
Commissioner Paul, can't you see? Americans want net neutrality. 85% of Republican voters
Want net neutrality! Stop representing telecoms! Represent...
What's net neutrality? Commissioner Paul!
Represent the people, not the Comcast Verizon monopolies! Represent the people! Stop representing Comcast! You're the public interest, not for the corporate interest. We don't want a monopoly. We want the people to have the representation they need.
I want them to see the plan too.
Julie.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and thank you for doing this. Have you considered just releasing the plan yourself? I know that the chairman said he's not going to do that, but is there any way that you would consider just putting that online? I mean, whether or not that jeopardizes yourself and your current office, your current standing?
I suffer from the malady that I do take the FCC's rules and procedures seriously. And One corollary to that in this case is that a non-public document has to remain non-public unless authorized to be disclosed by the chairman. The chairman having told not just our committees of jurisdiction, but the American public that he's not going to release the plan, I simply cannot release it on my own as much as I would love to. I think it would promote an open and transparent debate. You would be able to see for yourself what is in the plan, and that would inform everybody's decisions. I think also, as a general matter, when the person on the street is told the FCC is about to vote on a 332 plan to regulate the Internet, and by the way, you're not going to be able to see it until possibly well after the FCC votes on it, it strikes people as absurd. And so I would hope that leadership would revisit that decision. But in the meantime, I'm afraid I'm going to be bound by the rules.
Kerry, if you could please speak into the microphone.
Sure thing. I'm Kerry Murakami. So do you to clarify, do you support the no blocking, no pay-partization, no throttling rules, but this is the wrong way to do it, or do you not support the rules?
I've been very clear from the beginning of this conversation that I believe in a free and open Internet. I believe that in the four freedoms, as former Chairman Powell espoused them. And so I believe that consumers in particular should be able to access the lawful content online of their choice. Today, the Internet is open and free. Consumers are able to access the lawful content of their choice. And so in my view, net neutrality rules are a solution in search of a problem. So for that reason, I don't think these rules are necessary. Now that said, in terms of transparency in particular, I do believe that customers should be able to access service plan information. That is one of the Powell Four Freedoms, as you know. And so, again, I think everyone agrees on the end goal. The question is whether this secret plan gets us there. And in my view, it takes us far astray.
Jim?
Jim Puzangaro with the LA Times. G.T. Sohn says only 8 of those pages are regulations. The rest are response to the nearly 4 million comments. Is that correct? And if that's correct, is it misleading to say this is 332 pages of new regulations?
That is not correct. Aside from the 8 pages of proposed rules, there are 79 pages detailing the provisions of the Communications Act and FCC regulations thereto, from which the FCC is or is not going to forbear from. That is pretty critical in terms of the overall plan to regulate the Internet. Now, none of that is established in the 8 pages of proposed rules. Moreover, those 8 pages are only the rules that would be codified in the Code of Federal Regulations. There's a host of uncodified rules sprinkled throughout the document. In addition to that, the rules themselves don't necessarily give you all the information about how the FCC interprets those rules or intends to apply those rules. And so there's extensive discussion about how this or that regulation will be interpreted, will be applied, and if and when the FCC might revisit a determination about the propriety of that regulation. And that simply highlights the fact that we need to make this plan public so that the American people can make a decision for themselves, whether it's just the 8 pages or the 79 pages of forbearance or the full 332 pages. I think transparency is our friend here, and it is vital for the American public to be informed.
Good morning, Commissioner.
Good morning.
Do you see adverse impacts for companies like Comcast, AT&T, and Verizon? And if so, what would those consequences be, in your opinion?
Well, I foresee adverse consequences to the entire Internet economy. I think that the imposition of these heavy-handed Title II regulations with shifting and vague forbearance is going to present onerous burdens on everybody across the entire landscape. Let me just start with some of the smaller providers, for example. I've spoken to a number of wireless ISPs, some of whom provide service, an alternative option, excuse me, to some of the most underserved residents of this country, who have told me that these kinds of Title II regulations are going to make it difficult, if not prohibitive, for them to stay in business. I've heard from small cable providers who have said that they simply don't have the manpower to deal with the compliance burden of Title II. And just 2 examples of how this will make their lives more difficult. In terms of pole attachments, their rates are going to skyrocket under Section 224. State property taxes in a number of states, including in the West, are going to skyrocket as a result of reclassification. That's something that small cable providers are unable to do. And Cedar Falls Utility, the very municipal broadband utility that President Obama visited in Iowa, visited with my office recently, and they told us that they oppose Title II regulation. Now, I would submit to you that when you have such a broad landscape of broadband providers using all these different technologies who don't have the scale of some of the providers you mentioned, talking about why Title II is a bad idea, that's something the FCC needs to listen to. And indeed, it's something that the Obama administration's own Small Business Administration told the FCC previous to the president's announcement that we should listen to. Think about the impact that our regulations would have on businesses, especially small ones. And so that's why I think it's critical for us to really release this plan so that everybody, not just providers, can understand how this is going to burden them.
If I could just follow up, but what about the larger carriers? I mean, do you think that they would suffer under this, or are they large enough to withstand the impact of these regulations?
Let me put it this way. I think everyone who supplies either a broadband internet access service or what the FCC now will call a broadband subscriber access service will suffer from the imposition of vast yet vague regulations predicated in part on sections 201, 202, and 208. In terms of rates, this post-regulation, rate regulation the FCC is going to embark upon is going to create tremendous uncertainty, in addition to being a boondoggle for the trial bar. In addition to that, the FCC's vast assertion of jurisdiction, not over what net neutrality was traditionally meant to conceive, the last mile connectivity, but over the entire internet. As I mentioned, the points of interconnection where the FCC would now be micromanaging physical interconnection points and through routes and what have you. I think that creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty if you're a business, big or small, trying to figure out how to deploy scarce capital to build out and to expand the network. And so those create uncertainty for the providers. I would add also that we should think about the impact also on consumers. Because if you have something like a zero rating plan that is possibly going to go extinct based on the FCC's transient say-so, then that's something that's going to be bad for consumers, and it will limit companies from wanting to differentiate themselves from their competition. That's something, obviously, it impacts consumers, but it's also bad for the providers who are seeking in a very competitive marketplace to gain an edge.
Good morning, Commissioner. Todd Shields, Bloomberg News.
Good morning.
Proponents of the plan think that they say that asserting Title II jurisdiction gives it a better chance of surviving in the appeals courts. What's your assessment of the litigation risk here?
What I will say about the litigation risk is that I think there are some substantial legal flaws in this order. I'm not going to go through in detail what they are. I'm going to save that material for my dissent a couple of weeks hence. But what I will say is that a number of communications lawyers are going to find plenty of grist for the mill in this document. I also think that there are enough moving pieces that aren't adequately explained that the agency is going to have an uphill battle, both with respect to reclassification and with respect to the forbearance section.
So we'll have an uphill battle to keep the courts from striking down the rules?
I mean, I can't speculate on what a court ultimately will do. All I can tell you is that my own view is that the plan has a number of legal and policy flaws, and it'll be up to the outside parties to explore the latter. Oh, sorry.
Commissioner,
Morning.
Carrie Pickett with the Daily Caller. Just want to get your thoughts on this particular proposal in regards to editorial content and how certain types of editorial content could be squeezed out, and some content could be looked more favorably as opposed to other content. If you should talk about that. Sure.
Well, the plan is a little bit vague about that, and I think part of the problem is that its exertion of jurisdiction is so vast that it's sort of difficult to see in which direction this FCC or a future FCC may go with respect to that kind of content. But what I will say is that it opens the door to anyone online, as I said in my statement. I mean, literally an edge provider is defined as anybody who supplies any content, any service, any application over the internet to file a complaint with the commission or in federal court, essentially bringing the FCC into the business of managing that relationship. And I think that's something that ultimately is going to mire us in the muck of litigation for years to come, and ultimately will create a lot of uncertainty that will redound to the detriment of consumers.
We're going to continue down the line, Katie.
Good morning, Congressman. Katie Bachman, Politico.
Well, I didn't get a promotion, but I'm still a commissioner. So,
so I'm going to take a left turn, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about the privacy statute in there and some people have said that this gives the FCC some broad mandates to look at privacy on the internet and mobile. And I was wondering if you thought it might extend to apps and some of the things that, instead of just, the customer information.
That's a great question. I don't want to get into too much detail about what is in the document with respect to privacy in Section 222 of the Communications Act in particular. If you'd be interested, I'd be happy to connect you with Nick Degani, our Wireline legal advisor, to speak with you offline about some of that.
Thanks.
Brian.
Morning, Commissioner. Brian
Rocking
Fung.
the pocket square. I like that.
Thank you. Brian Fung from the Washington Post. Can you tell us anything about what suggestions you may be offering the chairman as to how you would want to see the draft rules amended? Maybe you're not proposing anything. Could you sort of give us a little bit of insight on that process?
Well, at this point, I think that the minority commissioner's views have certainly not been solicited throughout the administrative process, so I'm not hopeful that over the next 2 weeks we'll be able to change course. I think additionally, it is clear from the reporting that has been done by some of your colleagues that there are exogenous political influences in this particular proceeding. And the President essentially having directed the FCC in early November to take action which departed dramatically from the course we are heading upon, it is unclear the extent to which there's going to be flexibility to change the details of this plan.
Brooks. If you feel like the public should see the plan, why don't you just release it yourself? Are you afraid that you'll get put in jail or fined? I mean, what actually could they do to you?
I have been asked repeatedly that on Twitter, over email, and in person, including by my own mother, what would happen if you just put this out there on the Internet? And I'm not clear what the sanction would be, but again, I start from the premise that the rules are the rules. And as much as I believe that transparency and openness are critical for the American public to know about how this plan is going to dramatically transform the Internet economy, unless and until the chairman authorizes its disclosure, I simply can't do it. And I know that's an unsatisfactory answer to you, to millions of other people, including myself, who want to know what is in this plan. But, again, I'm a rule of law kind of guy, and until there's a little more latitude for me to disclose it, I can't do any more than I've done today.
Hey, Commissioner.
Hi.
I guess I'm sorry, I'm just a little bit confused. The chairman's office has said a number of times this doesn't include regulation of consumer prices. When you're saying it does, are you talking about the interconnection point, or are you saying they're being misleading about the consumer prices, and why are they saying that, and what's the difference?
As a threshold matter, your question pinpoints exactly the point I was making earlier. This is why we need to release the plan. You shouldn't have to rely on caduling press conferences, fact sheets, etc., to try to figure out what the truth is. A couple of weeks before the FCC is proposing to dramatically transform the Internet economy. You should be able to see for yourself without having to ask a public official this question. With respect to the question, though, it is clear in this document that the FCC is going to subject both the broadband Internet access services provided to end users and broadband subscriber access services provided to edge providers to Sections 201, 202, and 208. Now, as I said, Sections 201 and 202, the core of them is the requirement of just and reasonable charges. And if you pair that with Section 208's promise of an enforcement remedy, being able to come to the Commission and file a complaint, or go to court to file a complaint, it's unmistakable that the FCC, based essentially on its own ad hoc determination of what is just and reasonable, is going to be deciding ex post what reasonable rates are. It's an inescapable conclusion. And so I think once the document is released after February 26th, you'll be able to see that what I'm telling you is correct, and it's going to create a very impenetrable haze of uncertainty for providers who are trying to figure out what service offerings to make.
Do you think the chairman is lying?
Well, I don't want to think they're lying. What I think is that they are putting their spin on a proposal, and that's part of the reason why I'm here. I mean, had the document been released, I submit to you that I wouldn't be standing up here. I would be pondering how to proceed in private. But I think that it is important to correct the record because this is something that is so fundamentally important to the future of this country. It has often been stated, regardless of partisan affiliation on this dais, that the Internet is the 21st century platform for innovation, for education, for healthcare, et cetera. And if that's true, then it seems to me the FCC should be in the business of letting the public know what it's poised to do with respect to that platform. Alina, I think.
Hi, I just wanted to double check, circle back to the issue of interconnection oversight.
Mm-hmm.
Does it allow for the flexibility, or sort of, does it allow for, flexibility is a good word, for future potential disputes that might be brought not just by the ISPs, but the CDNs as well as the ISPs themselves?
I would answer that by simply saying that the agency asserts vast jurisdiction over the entire panoply of interconnection-related disputes that could arise. And it makes clear, in one paragraph in particular, that the agency retains the authority to require physical interconnection, the deployment of infrastructure in particular ways to handle traffic, the routing of that traffic over those connections. And when you combine that sort of micromanaging of infrastructure decisions with the application of ex post rate regulation to interconnection, what you have is essentially a free-for-all in which the agency, based on vague standards and, again, on an ad hoc case-by-case basis, apparently, will decide what's reasonable and what's not. And it could well be that anyone from an edge provider to a CDN might get swept up in this regulatory ambit.
So presumably there could be a scenario in which an ISP under these new rules could bring a case against an edge provider or a CDN.
I will double check, but my interpretation was not that it foreclosed that avenue, that it was only edge providers who could bring complaints against ISPs.
We will do a second round. If you don't have a question, feel free to pass. Julia.
Thank you again. On the fees, on the taxes issues, supporters of Title II always say, no, there's the Internet Tax Freedom Act. This cannot happen. What's your response to that? Is that
I've heard
inaccurate?
supporters of the Internet Tax Freedom Act make that same argument. And what I will tell you is that aside from that act, which relates to taxes on Internet access, this order explicitly leaves the door open for the imposition of an array of federal and state taxes and fees on broadband. And ultimately, those are going to be passed along to consumers, completely independent of the act. I can't put it any clearer than that.
I mean, there's the prohibition about releasing the order, but isn't there a prohibition against discussing it? And if so, are you violating that right now?
No, I've been very careful not to quote the order, only to describe its contents in very general ways, with the exception of one quote with respect to the Internet Content Standard, which was quoted in the chairman's own fact sheet put out last week. And so because I'm a stickler for the rules, I wanted to make sure that, to the extent I could, I revealed what I've understood the document to be.
The chairman and supporters of this proposal point to Title II regulation of mobile voice, and they say that light touch regulation worked fine. That didn't slow down investment in mobile voice for years when mobile voice was driving mobile rollout before mobile broadband. Mm-hmm. Why do you think this would be different than what happened with mobile voice?
An excellent question, and I think the key is to focus on the right service. Mobile broadband has never been a telecommunications service. It has been classified as an information service. And there is no question, if you look at the investment patterns, especially since the introduction of smartphones in 2007 and thereafter, that mobile broadband investment is what is driving the tremendous benefits that wireless consumers have been seeing in recent years. It's not so much the more regulated mobile voice offering, but it's mobile broadband that customers are using to access the web, to essentially to use the internet over their mobile devices to gain all kinds of benefits. And I think that is very instructive, that if we have a lightly regulated mobile broadband service, we'll enable some of the providers to make the investments in mobile broadband that are proving that the United States is a leader in the wireless marketplace today.
For years, it was mobile voice that was driving, and mobile voice was accelerating. The service was improving before there was any mobile broadband, and that Title II regulation, they say, did not inhibit that at all. You saw different generations, and you saw the movement to digital voice. All of that took place with mobile voice under Title II? Why couldn't that happen, that light touch happen again with Internet?
Two responses. First, if you look at the dramatic pace of change since mobile broadband really took off, I mean, I think it's pretty clear it dwarfs anything in terms of the trajectory of mobile voice in the years that it was more heavily regulated as a Title II service. But secondly, again, think about the comparison with Europe when it comes to mobile broadband or mobile services in general. If you look at the metrics in terms of 4G LTE penetration, wireless broadband speeds, et cetera, there's no question that America is ahead of where Europe is today. As I said, 86% of Americans now have access to 4G LTE, and it's 12 megabit per second speeds, despite the fact that we have a dramatically lower population density than Europe. And I think that's a direct consequence of the fact that we have very different modes of regulating the wireless space. And so again, I think the proof is in the pudding. I think there's no one who looks at this marketplace and would find it to be less competitive than Europe if they look at these objective metrics. Thus far, I've heard no one dispute.
Commissioner, do you see anything positive about this proposal? And if so, how do the positive elements weigh against the negative? Do they outweigh them or come up short?
Well, having said repeatedly that I believe net neutrality rules are a solution in search of a problem, I am not a big fan of this secret plan to regulate the Internet. And I think it is also important to remember that this is a distraction from what net neutrality supporters, most of them anyway, really want. I mean, when I've spoken with people across this country, whether it is entrepreneurs in Kalamazoo, Michigan, whether it is students at College Station, Texas, whether it is parents of school kids in Los Angeles, California, what they tell me is that they want greater competition. They want more choices at better prices, offering more services. This document takes us dramatically away from that goal. By forcing these Title II regulations on an otherwise healthy marketplace that doesn't need them, it distracts us from the goal of providing broadband opportunities to all Americans. There are all kinds of things we could be doing, but for the fact that this document has sucked up so much of the oxygen in this building. There's a lot we can do in terms of getting rid of some of the barriers to infrastructure investment. We could update some of our rules to take account of the IP transition. We could streamline more of our wireless infrastructure rules to provide more wireless broadband to Americans. There are a lot of things we could be doing to solve the purported problem that net neutrality advocates care about. Yet ironically, this document is taking us down a rabbit hole.
Hello again. Do you expect Chairman Wheeler's proposal to pass the agency on the vote on the 26th, and how will you vote?
You would have to ask my other colleagues how they're going to vote, but as you might surmise from my comments to date, I am not a huge fan of the President's plan to regulate the Internet.
Hi. So, I mean, most people think it's going to be 3-2, right? So what happens then after that, and what would your role then be? I mean, what's the next step? If this is going to happen, probably, so where does that leave us?
This is a very important question. A lot of people seem to assume that after February 26th, we simply move on to other things. February 26th is not the end date for this issue. For one thing, the document itself has to be released at some point, and typically that's going to take some time for something of this length. There are a number of edits that happen after the item's actually adopted and before it's released. And even then, once it's released, then parties will have a chance to study it and to file challenges to it in the courts, and that's going to send us into litigation. Additionally, with respect to forbearance, I think there's an issue that I should flag for your attention, and that could create some issues. Nowhere in the document does the FCC predicate the application of Title II regulations on a Court of Appeals finding that the forbearance determination is appropriate. So, and in fact, the item goes to some lengths to say that it's what it calls Title II light touch regulation is critical to investment and innovation. But it also then goes to have a severability section in which it says that if any part of the order is struck down, then the remainder will still persist. And so you could end up in a situation where all of the Title II regulations remain upheld, yet the forbearance determinations are ultimately struck down. That could end up embroiling the FCC in not just litigation, but a whole host of rulemakings. Essentially, the item tees up a number of future rulemakings with respect to all kinds of services that will have to happen at some point. And happy to describe what those, in general terms, what those are at a later date. But there are other rulemakings that are going to flow from this document. And so both from a regulatory and a litigation perspective, the FCC is going to expend a substantial amount of resources in future months, probably years, trying to iron out some of the kinks in this order.
So I just wanted to, two things, just pick up one more time on the previous question that I asked you, just confirm, so you're not going to be making any proposals or proposed changes to the document to the chairman. And then the second question here is, can you talk a little bit about where you see Congress's role here? Are they sort of the voice of reason as from where you sit?
Let me tackle the second question first. Obviously, there has been a legislative solution that folks on both sides of Capitol Hill have pursued, and that's a conversation I think is for the political actors to determine. I'll simply say that the FCC, now having twice been rejected by the courts in its attempts to regulate the Internet, it would suggest that a legislative solution is the best way forward. In fact, when the Verizon decision came down last year, I said that now is the time for the FCC to turn to Congress for guidance on this question. Additionally, as you probably know, a number of representatives have submitted inquiries to the agency in terms of oversight, and that's something I intend to fully cooperate with. And I don't speculate on where it's going to go, but that's something that has been out there. In terms of what I'm going to propose, or if I will propose anything, obviously, I don't support the imposition of Title II regulations as described in this plan. Now, to the extent the FCC is hell-bent on imposing those regulations, I don't see there's much flexibility for me to offer a change that is likely to be accepted. But that said, if there is a way forward, I'll never say never.
Didn't you Republicans on the panel paint yourself into a corner with the hell no, I won't go attitude on net neutrality? The NPRM was heavily 706, a couple of votes on your side of the dais, and we'd be looking at a completely different order.
A couple of responses to that. First, our input on the NPRM was explicitly rejected when we got an inquiry about whether or not some joint deliberations could happen. We said, yes, our door is always open. That door no one ever walked through that door. Secondly, if you look at where the NPRM was and where this document is taking us, it is very clear that, as I said again, outside political influences determined the trajectory of where the FCC is going. Even after, it's been publicly reported that even after the president made his announcement, leadership of the FCC was trying to socialize a different alternative to Title II. It is only now when we receive this 332-page document that it becomes clear that the president's plan to regulate the Internet is going to be the FCC's plan to regulate the Internet. Given its breadth and its scope and its timing and its nature, there's no question that that's where we're going. And so I view this not as a political exercise, but as one who serves as the privilege of serving at an independent expert agency. I view this as a technical question. What is the best way to ensure an open Internet experience for all Americans? I have a ton of ideas to put on the table and that I have put on the table. But again, this is an entirely politically driven distraction at this point that, frankly, is not of our doing.
So let me ask a little follow-up on that. You've repeatedly said the president's plan, Obama's plan, that sort of stuff. Do you have any independent knowledge that the White House exerted undue influence on the chairman's office in writing the net neutrality plan?
The Wall Street Journal has publicly reported that White House aides were running what it called a parallel FCC. And it strikes me as no coincidence that soon after the president's announcement, we were delivered a document that, according to virtually every publication I've read, including many of your own, this plan mimics, in its essential details, everything the president wanted. That's not a coincidence.
But you don't have any independent knowledge yourself, other than the news reports, that that was what occurred?
Well, Brooks, I rely on the conscientious reporting of people like you to tell us what the facts are.
I feel for you.
Do you think in a few years, if Republicans control the commission, do you think it would be a good idea to repeal this wholesale, or at that point does it become, too complicated and providers are complying with these rules and you would just sort of tweak it around the edges? Or would that be like the first thing that a Republican commission would do?
Well, as I said in response to Katie's question, I think there are a number of events that are going to happen subsequent to the adoption, or not, of this order on February 26th. Ultimately, those could lead to a successful court challenge, in which case the answer to your question would become moot. And so I don't want to speculate on all of the chain of events that would have to lead to that decision becoming a live question.
Yes, I just wanted to double back to midway through your speech, you addressed sponsored data and zero rating. Can you describe in as much detail as you can how exactly this order you see addresses those particular services? You said that they may violate in the future. That indicates to me that right now they would be allowed potentially at the doors of future regulations.
Just let me be clear. Under this grab bag standard of internet conduct, the agency tees up any number of practices from T-Mobile's Music Freedom Program or other sponsored data plans or usage-based pricing. All of it is swept into this category of other internet conduct that could be scrutinized by the agency. And the document tees up I think 7 vaguely defined factors to try to give guidance, as it puts it, to the outside world as to what's going to be allowed and what's not. But as I look at it, I find it hard to figure out which way the agency would come down on any particular question. That's what it suggests, but it doesn't suggest with any certainty, certainly not to me, and I would imagine not to the providers or consumers, whether or not these service plans, which millions of consumers like, are going to be allowed anymore.
As far as implementation is concerned, what kind of timeline do you see after the February 26th vote?
There is a time after which, as I said, the agency is going to make certain changes to the document, I imagine. That's usually what happens after the FCC adopts an order. But it doesn't get released that day. The staff will make a number of different changes suggested by offices in the majority. Then the document will be released. That's at some point thereafter. There's a whole administrative process in terms of publication in the Federal Register, et cetera. So it's the time frame is going to be unclear, but there are a number of different administrative steps which are going to take us some time beyond February 26th.
Will smaller companies begin to get letters as far as process, et cetera, as far as what kind of instructions they should be proceeding forth with, et cetera, or no?
I'd be happy to speak to you offline about that. I mean, traditionally, once we post the document publicly and release in the Federal Register, the nation is considered to have notice of what the agency has proposed to do or actually is doing. And thereafter, there's a time for a variety of different administrative steps for them to have further input.
Okay, we're out of time. That's all, folks.
Thanks so much for coming. And
Can I do a quick
Sure.
follow-up?
Okay.
2 quick things. You said the net neutrality is a solution in search of a problem. Would you be supportive of the congressional legislation which puts in place a number of things? And secondly, the FCC has made a number of big decisions over its history. Have you been able to find any precedent of the FCC releasing the wording of those proposals before the vote that you can point to Chairman Wheeler to say you should do what we did here?
Mm-hmm. I'll take again the second question first. I'm not sure whether there is any precedent for the release of a document of that kind, but on the other hand, as has been pointed out many times, this is no ordinary item. Over 4 million people have weighed in with the agency expressing their views about what the American people should do. The President himself, in what Brian called in a report, an unusual attempt to influence an agency, has expressed his pronouncement about what he wants the agency to do. I can't think of another time during my time at the Commission, both as a commissioner and formerly as a staffer, in which the agency is embroiled in such a high-profile public issue. And it seems to me, again, particularly to the extent that this document relates to the Internet economy, arguably the core of our future economic competitiveness and growth, that we should be releasing it for the public to see for themselves. Again, the law gives the chairman the discretion to release a document for a reason. And the fact that it might not have been exercised previously on everything from AM radio licensing deals to what have you doesn't mean that when it comes to the regulation of the Internet, the public shouldn't know. And with respect to your first question, which was...
Yes,
bill,
which would put in place restrictions for a problem that you don't see needing a solution right now.
Right. Again, there are two key distinctions between that legislation and what the agency is proposing to do.
Yeah.
First, as I said, it's the FCC is adopting utility-style regulation, and second, it's asserting jurisdiction over the entire Internet. So I think part of what the impetus for the legislative effort that you're seeing is an attempt to head off the worst aspects of the president's plan to regulate the Internet. And to the extent that Congress sees fit to change the law, that is obviously something I will dutifully implement. But I don't see it as my place to opine about the particulars of the legislation or its merits or whether certain political actors should endorse it.
Okay, that's all, folks.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming.